Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really fascinating deep dive ahead of us today. It's all built entirely around source material, detailing a notable television appearance where Caroline Leavitt challenged former President Barack Obama.
That's right. And your sources, they described this event as a pretty intense debate, covering several major areas: media trust and alleged manipulation, the Iran nuclear deal, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare,
Right.
and also former President Obama's activities after he left office.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Our mission, really, in this deep dive is to explore the key accusations Leavitt made, the responses Obama gave, and the evidence that was presented, all exactly as it's described in the sources you shared with us.
Mm-hmm.
We want to understand the core points of this confrontation and what your sources suggest it might mean, the bigger picture.
Yeah, the context of political polarization, information scrutiny, all of that. Think of it like we're tracing the threads in a really complex tapestry. We're going to break down the core claims and counterclaims your sources lay out just to help you see the described picture a bit more clearly.
Okay, sounds good. So let's jump right in. Let's set the stage as your sources describe it.
Yeah.
This debate, it took place in the American Pulse studio and the atmosphere.
Described as electric. Tense, even.
Wow.
Yeah, and the host introduced it, according to the source, as a historic moment, kind of framing it as a quest for truth, deeply divided era, big framing.
And the sources immediately ground this whole thing in the context of public trust, or maybe the lack of it.
Yeah.
In the media, they actually cite some surveys, Gallup showing only 30% trust the media,
Mm-hmm.
Pew Research saying only 16% believe it's fair.
That low? Wow.
Yeah, and another Gallup poll where only 34% believe the press reports accurately. So you can kind of see why this context is so crucial when the debate's first big topic is media manipulation.
Exactly. So the stage is set. You've got Leavitt, described as this young political star, a spokesperson for the Mangier movement, facing off against Barack Obama, who's depicted as, an icon of calm and authority.
And the source tells us the core question posed right at the start is whether legacies are a step forward or a burden.
Mm-hmm.
It really frames the whole discussion that's about to happen.
Which brings us, directly into the first point of contention outlined in your sources: media trust and alleged manipulation.
Okay. Leavitt, according to the source, she kicks off with a really direct accusation. She claims Obama orchestrated media campaigns specifically to attack Mitt Romney in 2012
Right.
and Donald Trump in 2016. The aim being apparently to undermine voter trust.
And that hits right at the heart of that media trust issue the source brought up earlier.
Exactly.
And she didn't stop there, apparently. The source says she also claimed Obama coordinated with media outlets to craft negative narratives. And then she presented what the source describes as her evidence.
Okay, evidence. So the source says this evidence included a timeline shown on screen.
Yeah, with headlines of negative articles about Romney and Trump from those years.
And she also presented a list of meetings between Obama and major editors in 2012 and 2016.
Which she labeled as manipulation. That was her framing, according to the source.
Right. And maybe the most striking part, according to the source, was an internal email she showed.
The email.
Yeah, where an advisor allegedly wrote something like, "Push the narrative about Romney's business record."
Ooh.
So her core assertion, based on all this described evidence, that he didn't respect the press, but actually turned it into a political weapon.
That's a really strong claim to open with, especially given those low trust numbers the source mentioned.
Definitely.
Obama's response, though, as reported in the sources, was apparently a strong, direct denial. He called the accusations entirely false, stated he always respected press freedom, never directed campaigns,
Okay.
and he asserted the press operates independently.
And specifically addressing that evidence,
Yeah.
Leavitt presented the timeline, the meetings, the email.
Yeah.
The source says Obama responded directly that it was fabricated, stating very clearly, apparently, documents are not real.
Wow. So that sets a really contentious tone right from the get-go, a direct clash, not just on policy interpretations, but on the very validity of the information being shown.
Yeah, real he said, she said on the facts themselves. Okay, so moving on from media, your sources say the debate then shifted to foreign policy, specifically the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA.
Right. And this is described in the source as a celebrated yet controversial foreign policy. The source also raises the question about America's role in escalating Middle East tensions, linking it back to that bigger question about legacies.
Makes sense. And Levitt's accusation about the deal, according to the source, was pretty pointed. She claimed it was a dangerous agreement signed mainly to polish his legacy,
Mm.
posing significant risks, she said, to America and allies like Israel.
And she asserted it empowered Iran, funded terrorism, and weakened regional security. And again, the source says she presented her described evidence for this.
Okay, so what did that look like this time? What kind of evidence?
Well, the source says she showed a chart on screen. This chart supposedly indicated Iran's military spending increased by 40% after the deal.
40% of
Yeah.
that.
And she also questioned why Iran received $1.7 billion in cash right after the deal was signed.
Ah, the cash payment. I remember that being discussed.
Exactly. And the source also mentions she presented another internal email.
Another one.
Yeah, where an official allegedly wrote, "Payment must be kept quiet to avoid controversy. This is funding terrorism."
Wow. So her core assertion from all of that,
Hmm.
that the deal didn't bring peace.
But instead, quote, "armed the enemy." That was her line, reportedly.
Heavy stuff. So Obama's response.
To these specific claims, as the sources report it, was that calling the deal a concession is false. That's a direct quote reported. He claimed the agreement successfully stopped Iran from developing nuclear weapons and was recognized internationally as a diplomatic step forward.
Okay. And what about her evidence? The chart, the payment.
Well, regarding her chart, he reportedly stated it lacks context. And he rejected the idea that the deal harmed security.
And the $1.7 billion payment.
Yeah.
That's a specific point.
His response apparently was that it's entirely misleading to call it funding terrorism. He claimed it was part of resolving long-standing financial disputes, describing it as a transparent and legal action and within the framework of an international agreement.
So framing it very differently.
Completely. He also reportedly asserted the deal received strong international support, including from the UN.
And his broader context, as described by the source.
Was that this was a strategy specifically designed to prevent a nuclear war, safeguard regional peace, and ensure global security.
So you have these two clashing narratives. One side saying it's a dangerous concession, arming an enemy.
Right.
The other saying it prevented nuclear war and safeguarded peace, with direct fights over the meaning of the money and the data.
Exactly. A really stark contrast presented in the sources.
And the debate, it seems, moved on to another huge area, one impacting pretty much every American family: healthcare policy.
Yep, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare.
And the sources frame this part by noting concerns about prescription drug costs, affordability.
Yeah, they cite a Kaiser Family Foundation survey where nearly 50% expressed concern.
So that sets the stage for why this topic is, well, so sensitive for people.
Definitely. And Levitt's accusation here, according to the source, was that Obamacare is a broken promise and it's economically harming Americans.
And again, framed as being done just to polish his legacy. That seems to be a recurring theme in her described arguments.
It does. She claimed he promised people could keep their doctors and plans, but that millions lost both and they ended up facing skyrocketing costs.
Okay, and what did the source say was her evidence for this one?
This time, the source describes her showing another chart. This one indicated insurance costs rose 25% since Obamacare was implemented.
25% increase, okay.
And she also questioned why millions reportedly lost their preferred plans because of the law's regulations.
And let me guess, another alleged internal email.
I got it. Described in the source, an official supposedly wrote, "Need to mitigate backlash over individual plan cancellations." And she added, according to the source, "This is proof you knew people would lose their insurance."
So her core assertion on healthcare, the law didn't improve things, it actually pushed Americans into financial chaos.
And prioritized his legacy over people's actual needs. That was the chart.
Right. So Obama's response, as the source reports it?
He apparently said calling Obamacare a burden is not only an oversimplification, it's a distortion. He claimed it expanded coverage to over 20 million Americans, bringing the uninsured rate down to historic lows. He reportedly stated, "That's not a promise, it's a fact."
Okay. What about the cost figures she presented? The 25% increase.
His response was that those figures lack context, stating they don't account for subsidies or the protections for pre-existing conditions or even the cost increases that were happening before the law was passed.
Context matters, he's saying. And the alleged email about plan cancellations.
His response was apparently very direct. That email isn't real.
Another flat denial of the document's authenticity.
Exactly. He claimed the law did improve healthcare access, protected people with pre-existing conditions, and is actually supported by most Americans.
So his core assertion and response was what?
That leaving millions uninsured is the real burden, flipping the script on her claim.
Okay, so another direct clash. Conflicting data interpretations, conflicting views on the law's impact, and these explicit denials of the alleged internal emails.
It's a pattern described throughout the source's account of the debate.
And finally, the debate, as described in your sources, it tackled the topic of his post-presidency activities and influence.
Right. And the context here, according to the source, is that whole question of what role former leaders play after leaving office and this perception of, behind-the-scenes influence.
Okay, so Levitt's accusation, as described,
Was that Obama continued to manipulate American politics from behind the scenes, specifically through nonprofit organizations aimed at undermining the Trump administration.
manipulate from behind the scenes up.
She claimed he funded anti-Trump movements, stirring political chaos to maintain his influence.
And her described evidence to back this up.
Well, the source says she presented yet another chart. This one showed funding from Obama-linked organizations apparently rose 50% between 2017 and 2020.
50% increase in funding.
And surprise, surprise, another alleged internal email was shown.
Let me guess.
An advisor supposedly wrote, "Increase funding to civic groups to maintain political pressure." And she reportedly added, "This is proof you directed from the shadows."
Wow. And the source also mentions a report.
Yeah, a report was apparently shown detailing post-presidency funding of $50 million to civic movements between 2017 and 2020.
$50 million. So Levitt's core assertion from all this.
That he didn't really leave politics, he built a network to disrupt, was pulling strings, and actively undermined a duly elected administration. Strong words.
Very strong. Okay, Obama's response to these specific accusations, as the source reports it.
Was that accusing him of manipulating from behind the scenes is false.
Ah,
He claimed his post-presidency focus has been on philanthropy and education, not political interference.
and the evidence you presented, the chart, the email, the report.
Regarding the chart, the source says his response was, again, that it lacks context. And he rejected the whole notion he undermined the administration.
And the alleged email and report.
He reportedly stated directly, that email isn't real, and that memo does not reflect the truth. Consistent denials of the documents.
Right.
He claimed the organizations linked to him focus on education and civic rights, not politics, and explicitly said they do not serve partisan political goals.
So his core assertion was basically a complete rejection of the idea he was manipulating politics.
Yes, calling it a distortion of the motives and work of hundreds of people.
Okay. So claims of a hidden network pulling strings versus claims of focusing on education and philanthropy.
Exactly. And again, conflicting interpretations of funding data and these flat-out denials of the alleged internal communications.
Now, your sources also describe Levitt presenting some additional evidence, challenges right near the end, trying to bolster arguments, the source says.
Yes, exactly. She brought in what the source describes as support from two other people, an investigative journalist named Daniel Harper and a former staffer, Sarah Mitchell.
Okay, so bringing in outside voices described as witnesses. How did that play out?
Well, via Harper, as described, she presented a document titled Internal Pressure to Conceal Iran Deal Violations. Harper allegedly uncovered a chain of internal emails. More emails.
Right.
Showing Mr. Obama was informed that Iran violated the terms and he personally directed that information be kept secret.
Personally directed secrecy about violations. That's huge. It was described as systematic deception.
Extremely impactful claim, yeah. Obama's response to this specific point, according to the source, was that the documents are not authentic.
Again, with the authenticity.
Yep. He claimed the Iran deal was overseen by a rigorous international inspection system, and there was simply no evidence of concealment. He called these specific accusations an attempt to distort history.
Okay. Then what about the former staffer, Sarah Mitchell?
Via Mitchell, as described, a memo was shown. This one said, $10 million allocated to civic organizations to increase political pressure. Her sick Barack Obama's directive.
So a specific memo with a dollar amount and attributing it directly to him.
And Mitchell allegedly confirmed you directed funding to anti-Trump groups. This was described as political string pulling.
Okay. Obama's response to this memo and Mitchell's alleged confirmation.
According to the source, direct again, the memo does not reflect the truth. He reiterated his point that these organizations focus on civic education, democratic participation, supporting minority communities.
Not partisan goals.
Exactly, not partisan goals. He again rejected the accusation of manipulating politics.
And the source says Levitt's final challenge was, what, a montage?
Yeah, she played a montage of interview clips, apparently. Harper allegedly saying, emails confirm Obama requested Iran violations be kept secret. And Mitchell allegedly saying, I saw budgets funding anti-Trump groups firsthand.
So ending with these sound bites from her described witnesses.
Right. And Levitt's final assertion after presenting all this, as described in your source, was pretty blunt and direct. She said to him, you're not transparent, you manipulate, you didn't step back, you control.
Wow. Heavy ending. The source describes the studio atmosphere after this as tense, silent.
Yeah, tense silence, you can imagine.
And it didn't just end in the studio, right?
Yeah.
Your source details the aftermath, the broader implications.
Oh, yeah. Social media, particularly X, apparently saw a firestorm of public opinion. It became a real space for polarization.
How so? What did the source say?
Well, the source says pro-MAGA accounts reportedly stated things like, Karoline crushed Obama, calling her a warrior for truth.
Okay.
Meanwhile, accounts described as being on the left fired back, saying she distorts the truth. They defended the Iran deal, saying it stopped a nuclear arms race, and demanded she prove her emails were real, challenging her evidence.
And the media coverage.
Yeah.
Also polarized.
Described that way, yes. The source mentions CNN reportedly calling Levitt a provocateur, while Fox News hailed her as a reformer. Very different takes.
Makes sense, given the content. And the source then describes Levitt at a public rally.
Yeah, sparking what the source calls a movement demanding truth from leaders. She reportedly mentioned Harper and Mitchell again, and people had Truth First banners.
Truth first.
Her described message was focused on her legacy being this movement, empowering people to verify truth for themselves.
And Obama's response in the aftermath, described as being at a charity event.
Right. He reportedly stated Levitt has the right to ask questions, but firmly added that her accusations are wrong. He reportedly said his legacy is about serving the people with integrity.
So, sticking to his position, what about this Truth First movement mentioned?
Your sources tell us this movement, described in the aftermath, actually grew on X. It urged citizens to verify sources themselves. They mentioned fact-checking organizations reportedly releasing reports re-examining the Iran deal and those post-presidency funding allegations.
So it sparked actual follow-up investigation, or at least reporting on it.
It seems so. And community groups reportedly held workshops on leadership accountability, so it seems to have touched a nerve beyond just the online arguments.
Interesting. And the source concludes by saying this whole story reflects what?
Current political polarization, obviously, but also a strong demand for transparency and that pervasive distrust in institutions we talked about earlier.
And it points out that Levitt's method using charts, alleged emails, described witnesses, reflects a growing trend.
Yeah, a trend to rely on independent information, maybe social media, to try and verify truth, highlighting the power, perhaps, of that described truth-first movement idea.
And the sources draw out some potential lessons from all this for real life.
They do. Things like proactively verifying information yourself, engaging constructively in discussions, demanding accountability from leaders, trying to avoid divisive emotions, and really focusing on finding verifiable truth. Easier said than done, maybe.
No kidding. So, okay, what does this all mean? We've taken a deep dive into your source material describing this incredibly charged televised debate.
Yeah, we've seen how Karoline Levitt, based entirely on the sources, presented these specific claims, how she used charts, these alleged emails, and the testimony of described individuals like Daniel Harper and Sarah Mitchell to challenge Barack Obama on key aspects of his presidency and his time after leaving office.
And we've also heard, just as described in your sources, Obama's strong denials, his counter-arguments, not just disputing the substance of the claims, but also the validity and authenticity of the evidence she presented. Those emails, those documents.
Right. And your sources highlight that this isn't just, a political clash. It connects to those bigger, really fundamental questions, like public trust in institutions, the huge challenge of verifying information in our polarized world today, and how public figures' legacies are perceived, how they're contested, how they're fought over.
And the sources tell us this debate resonated widely. It sparked further discussion, online and off, and even inspired this described Truth First movement focused on verification and accountability.
Ultimately, the sources seem to suggest that navigating these really complex issues requires you, the listener, to engage with information critically. and to actively seek transparency wherever you can.
Which brings us to a really important question raised by the source material, something for you to consider. In an era like ours, where different sides present conflicting information, conflicting narratives, and claim completely different sets of evidence, how do you personally approach verifying the truth about important public issues? And how do you demand accountability from leaders?
It's a challenge, right? And the source material suggests it's maybe more relevant now than ever before.